Welcome to the Recovery Playbook. I'm your host, Dr. Daryl Shorter.
And I'm your host, Ryan Leaf.
And today we are going to talk about the increasing use of cannabis. In a study that came out of Carnegie Mellon University, although alcohol overall remains more widely used, first-time daily cannabis use overtook drinking at the same frequency in 2022, with roughly 17.7 million cannabis users in comparison to 14.7 million drinkers. For today's conversation, we're going to discuss how increasing cannabis use has impacted the recovery community.
I am a abstinence man in recovery, I guess is the way you put it. I was never a cannabis user. In fact, ironically enough, I wasn't that big of a drinker even. So there isn't a large number of times where I've actually been drunk. The only drug I've ever taken in my life has been prescribed to me by a doctor. Opioid painkillers. I smoked marijuana one time while I was in Amsterdam because I figured,
When in Amsterdam.
And I did not enjoy it. We went and saw the movie Batman Begins, which is about hallucinating pretty much, and a bunch of it is. And so it was not, it wasn't a fun experience.
Who was he fighting in that one? Never mind.
I should know this. Ghoul. Something,
not the Mr. Freeze one.
It was Liam Neeson's character.
Ra's al Ghul.
Ra's al Ghul.
Yeah.
Yes, I knew it was a ghoul.
Critically.
But anyway, great movie. Horribly hallucinogenic while smoking Amsterdam marijuana when you've never smoked weed in your life.
Can't believe you did.
I digress. I think there's also an understanding of the thing we talked about in our last episode around the temple that is your body.
Yeah.
And alcohol, which being consumed is, though from the earth in a way or form, grain, can do so much more damage to what the idea of what cannabis does. Now, the way I interpret it, the way I talk to young kids about drugs simply are, I feel, when you're taking one, there's a why.
Mm-hmm.
Is it to alter your mood? Is it because you're not comfortable with who you are, with who you're around?
Mm-hmm.
Or are you trying to just take the edge off? The biggest thing was you would watch the 60s TV shows or sitcoms, and dad would get home from work and he'd always walk over to the little bar and pour himself a cocktail to take the edge off, right? Why are you doing something? Is there a medical reason behind it? So that's always the thing I'm looking for. I'm never going to be the person to go, you're a bad person for doing this.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like to use that term about anybody, Why are you doing something? With the introduction of fentanyl, it's become much a different conversation when I'm talking to the youth, because I'm like, hey, I usually want you to understand why you're doing something. But unfortunately now, because of the introduction of fentanyl, it doesn't really matter about the why this time, because you may take one pill and it can cause the end of your life.
That's right.
So that's the biggest thing for me. It doesn't surprise me one bit that with the legalization of marijuana, cannabis, gummies, CBD, pretty much in most states, that I think there's been a rise in the ability to A, get it,
Mm-hmm.
and B, not be so worried about what anybody else thinks about it, and to go about your business. So that's the best way I can probably speak to it. I'd love to hear your side of it, how you see it as it comes through the door. And for me, I've just heard a lot about the psychosis of marijuana, if it's morning to night.
So it's interesting. And one of the reasons I was curious about the recovery community's response to it is that cannabis is being prescribed in many states for lots of different conditions, both medical conditions as well as some psychiatric conditions. And so if the recovery community is in agreement with people taking prescribed medications, and a person in recovery who's like 12 steps sober gets a prescription for cannabis, is that allowed? And so I'm going to let you wrestle with that for a quick second while I do the thing. So cannabis use pretty much for adolescents, young adults under the age of 25 is, for me, a huge concern. Now, while cannabis has not been causally linked with psychotic disorders or schizophrenia, meaning we cannot point to just because you use cannabis, you're for sure going to develop schizophrenia. Yeah. And there are people that develop schizophrenia or other psychotic disorders that have never used cannabis before. So the literature, the research does not prove that there is a causal link. They have, however, proved that there is an increased risk for the development of a psychotic disorder, especially among folks who have used as an adolescent or during young adulthood. The reason that kind of magic number of 25 years old has been tossed out and talked about for so long is because really that's about the time that the brain has stopped developing. Mm-hmm. And really, if your brain is already developed, then hopefully going on to develop something like a psychotic disorder, the risk of that goes down significantly because you're not growing or developing a brain anymore. Where this gets a bit more complicated is that I think people oftentimes think about cannabis the way that it was presented back in the 60s and 70s, that, people like sort of smoke and toke, and that's just kind of it. However, currently the potency, the THC concentrations, THC being tetrahydrocannabinol, it's the psychoactive ingredient in cannabis plant. The potency, the concentration of THC in flower has gone up significantly. So, back in the 70s, maybe it was 5 to 7% THC. Now we're talking about products that are 20, 25, maybe as high as 30% THC. So people are getting a lot more of the psychoactive ingredient when they're smoking kind of the same amount. That's sort of the first thing, because growers got really, really good at doing their jobs. Yes. Chemists, totally chemists. And people are also, I think, smoking more, drinking less likely to engage in alcohol use, don't necessarily see alcohol consumption, especially among adolescents, don't see it as the rite of passage that it might have been for you or for me, where like your first beer was a big deal. Now it's like your first vape is a big deal.
Is the hangover, because is there less of a hangover? Because I haven't smoked marijuana. I don't know how that.
Yeah, so in theory, there's not as much, but people can certainly experience withdrawal symptoms as a result of using cannabis. So they can have higher levels of anxiety, both during use and after use. They can have changes with their sleep, changes with their appetite, with chronic use as well. But, a lot of times people, especially like adolescents and young adults, can mask a lot of the use of cannabis by just getting like dry eye drops to take the red out of their eyes. And they feel like they can function in a way. It's not necessarily like, depending on how you use it, it's not necessarily in your clothes or on your breath in the same way that you might have with alcohol. So people feel like they can conceal it a little bit better. And sometimes they are able to do so. So they're like smoking in the car on the way to work.
Or especially now with the gummies.
Oh my gosh, I didn't even think about that. Right. Of course, yes. The gummies, edibles, the way that people, Delta 8 is now the big one. Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course. So Delta 8 so there are different formulations of tetrahydrocannabinol. There's a Delta 9 THC, which is what sort of occurs within flower, but there's also Delta 8 THC, which is less. It's not as psychoactive, but can give people euphoria and a high as well. And it may not be detected in all types of
testing.
Yeah, so people have switched to Delta 8, and it is like fully legal in the same way that CBD or cannabidiol is. So people can like go to a head shop or a convenience store and buy Delta 8 over the counter in the same way that which you can't necessarily do for Delta 9 if it's not legalized for recreational purposes in your state.
You speak to how it's viewed in the recovery world. I don't like this moral judgment that comes from the recovery world. Like, our way is the only way. I spoke to it where we can be interpreted as cultish in a way, and how we go about our business. Everybody is different. If it's being prescribed by a doctor, I usually tend to fault on the side of the medical professional. I'm not a doctor. I don't understand the brain chemistry that certain individual may be dealing with. Therefore, I have no say in what they're doing, and I'm not going to judge them for it. Now, if by any chance down the line it becomes a real problem and it sends them back to their drug of choice or gets them in the same sort of, jackpot as their original drug of choice did, it's not going to surprise me.
Yeah.
And I don't think it would surprise anybody who's living in the recovery world. But to those who are in the recovery world that are incredibly judgmental around somebody, again, this is the thing where I tell you, you can only control the three things: your behavior, your attitude, and your effort. You can't control anybody else. You can't control what you do. You can't. That's all you can do. And having a 7-year-old right now, that is a big part of how I'm trying to raise him. Like, these are the three things you can control. And I'm sorry, kiddo, but for as much as I want to control you in a direction that I want you to go, I can't. I can give you the information, and then you're going to make the ultimate decision in all of this. And so like that, when someone comes into recovery or someone comes in where I'm, mentoring them or things like that, I tell them what worked for me. It's the only thing I have any sort of certainty in. Yeah. This is what's worked for me. And if I do this on a daily basis, I will lay my head down at night at peace with an unchaotic life. It's just how it's worked for me. And it's what I will continue to do. And I'll continue to support you with what you do through this process. But I think the recovery world is rather judgmental around it. Mm-hmm. I also think there's probably some jealousy in the recovery world that they can't do it. When people always talk to me about, like, when I was going through my radiation for my brain tumor, and the doctor came to me, he saw I was losing my hair, I was sick, and he offered to prescribe some painkillers. Like anybody who's going through that process, I was almost like I'm deserving of this. But me not being truthful with that doctor, saying I had a past with it, lends to the self that I'm the problem and that I'm different than everybody else. I'm the junkie where the other person is. And so when I take the pills, I become the larger problem in all this. So I think there's probably some semblance to truth in that. There's some jealousy to it.
Yeah. Well, I think the recovery community is going to have a lot to wrestle with in this conversation, because it doesn't seem like
it's going away.
It's going away. And neither are we. But just for now.
Yeah.
We'll see you next time. Thanks for being here.